Good evening and welcome to What's Wrong with Regular Chap. I'm Regular Chap. This, the second episode in this series, follows my general introduction to the role of the Midwit in the destruction of Western civilization. In it, I shall attempt to develop that thesis with a more detailed consideration of the intellectual limitations and emotional inadequacies which drive the Midwit towards bigoted groupthink and woke ideologies. And lest I be charged with unnecessary linguistic invention, I have titled it, What's Wrong with the Midwit? Well, the first problem with the Midwit is that he's not as clever as he would like to be and is insufficiently intelligent to compute the real-world evidence of his own mediocrity. The Midwit is a person of average intelligence and limited education who wishes to be perceived as a person of high intelligence and great authority. He mistakenly believes that the high intelligence to which he aspires manifests in the confident expression of certainties, especially upon current and contentious issues of great complexity, and of which he is invariably entirely ignorant. Examples might include such topics as the economic implications of Britain leaving the European Union, the correct management of a COVID pandemic, or the so-called science behind anthropogenic climate change theory. The Midwit further conflates high intelligence with being right, and because he doesn't know what he's talking about and isn't capable of independent thought, he is much concerned with affiliating himself with what he believes to be the consensus of enlightened opinion. Similarly, he seeks to align himself with the conclusions of so-called experts, even though he lacks the specialist knowledge to evaluate their credibility, or even whether they exist at all. He is neither a critical nor an original thinker. He wants to shout out that he is a member of the enlightened tribe who he imagines, not entirely without reason, to be the social elite. The Midwit is prone to exaggerate, in his own mind at least, the value and significance of his own unremarkable academic, creative or professional accomplishments. Reciprocally, he discounts the credentials of his betters should they challenge his adopted orthodoxy. Failing that, he seeks to discredit or silence the heretic through personal attacks and slanderous allegations that are completely irrelevant to the argument he is unable to rebut. The Midwit usually gathers much of what he misidentifies as information from online sources, and most, if not all, his opinions are in truth little more than slogans he has derived from others. When challenged on one of his opinions, often the first reaction of the Midwit is to reach for his phone so that he can Google up the slogan or soundbite he has just regurgitated. It is characteristic of the Midwit to express strong and intransigent opinions on subjects upon which he has neither the authority nor expertise to comment, whether it be the impact of COVID lockdowns, alleged Russian meddling in US elections, or the net fiscal impact of immigration to the United Kingdom. The hubristic certainty of the Midwit always betrays his complete ignorance of the subject on which he opines. Usually, such subjects are highly complex, and any informed analysis will be nuanced and need to accommodate a variety of interpretations. This does not suit the Midwit, who is neither sufficiently intelligent nor well informed, to engage in such analysis. And in any case, he requires all such debates to be reduced to right-wrong polar opposites, so that he can be right and thus abuse people who disagree with him as being ill-informed, less intelligent, and wrong. To adopt this position, the Midwit needs simple answers to difficult questions. He is, therefore, an inevitable student of liberal left dogma. Thus an issue of almost infinite complexity, such as Britain's relationship to the European Union, must be reduced to EU good, Brexit bad, and anyone and everyone who disagrees with that imbecilic analysis can then be abused, silenced, and disenfranchised. The Midwit is thus hostile to informed debate, as it is liable to expose his ignorance. Instead, he seeks communities, real or virtual, of like-minded people who will agree with him and confirm his rightness. These communities, obviously, are little more than echo chambers for wrong-think, or indeed non-think, the BBC being an egregious example. The Midwit is vain and intellectually insecure. The screeching self-righteous indignation which is so characteristic of the Midwit is little more than the unresolved anger of a small man with profound inferiority complexes. He seeks to project his rage at his own inadequacies through deriding and abusing others, especially those who he secretly envies. As is so often the case with inadequates and cowards, the midwit's deepest arousal comes with the opportunity to bully. This is why he flourishes in social media, especially Twitter, where he can hide behind aliases, shriek unilateral abuse, and slander with relative impunity. Midwits, who overwhelmingly adhere to the so-called progressive liberal orthodoxies, tend to puritanical views and a love of identifying transgression in others. They are never happier than when ganging up to shout down and abuse anyone who disagrees with them. Whether it be trans rights, Palestine, or the impact of mass immigration on housing, two things are always certain. The midwit will have all of the answers and none of the knowledge. The briefest review of the hate sheet that is the Guardian newspaper, or the output of many members of the Labour front benches, will reveal a level of normalised abuse, derision and slavering spite that is clearly pathological. Indeed, the Guardian newspaper quite explicitly feeds a continuous stream of formulaic lies and vicious hysteria to fuel the appetites of the midwits who read it. It's a kind of pseudo-intellectual porn. To read any, or God forbid all, of its columnists, Owen Jones, Marina Hyde, Polly Toynbee, Stuart Lee, John Crace, Simon Jenkins and the rest, is to wade through formulaic diatribes consistently and entirely devoid of cogent, informed or balanced argument. These people and the newspaper they work for trade exclusively in opinion, unsubstantiated claims, hyperbole, sneering insults, allegations and downright falsehoods. You have to be seriously stupid to believe anything you read in The Guardian. Indeed, I challenge any of those writers to provide me with a copy of that newspaper that does not exhibit all those characteristics within the first 5 pages, if not on the front page alone. Barely does a week go by without the words fury, anger, or outrage appearing super bold in a headline. The Guardian, which is the go-to read of the midwit, is undoubtedly the most dishonest and unpleasant broadsheet in English. It quite clearly has no editorial or political doctrine beyond identifying targets for abuse. That target is usually some fictive race such as Tories, Brexiters or Trump supporters. The politics of the Guardian reading midwit amounts to "we hate Tories, what was the question?" Read Jones, Toynbee or Hyde, or any of their other bug-eyed, bigoted colleagues, and replace the word Tories with immigrants, Jews or gays to hear the true racistic voice of the progressive left. The former Labour MP, Laura Pidcock, openly celebrated her bigotry in declaring that Tories were the enemy and that she could never be friends with a Tory. One could wonder how wide the net of her prejudice is cast. Does she refer to members of the governing cabinet, Conservative members of Parliament, members of the Conservative Party, or the millions of people who vote Conservative? One wonders whether she had ever considered that the medic delivering her baby may have been a Tory, or the man who delivers her post, or the pilot in whose hands she puts her life when flying on holiday. But thinking does not impede the utterances of such populist bigots. If it did, they might notice that the urge to malign such a large and diverse group of people is precisely the same as making similarly malicious generalizations about black people or any other group. Pidcock clearly exists in such a toxic vortex of normalized bigotry that she can announce this viciously stupid prejudice with pride, as if being a bigot is somehow a moral achievement. Although, of course, it is reasonable to question whether a graduate of Manchester Metropolitan University, or indeed any other member of the Labour Party, actually knows what the word bigot means. Pleasingly, this venomous individual, who boasted that she went to Westminster to be a mouthpiece for her constituents and class, was, with exquisite irony, replaced by them at the 2019 general election with a Tory. The current deputy leader of the British Labour Party, Angela Rayner, described Tories as racist, misogynist, homophobic scum, and then defended her remarks to the press, saying indeed that she had been holding back. That description includes, if we look briefly at the Conservative cabinet at the time she made that statement, 2 women of Indian heritage, one of African, an Iraqi immigrant, the son of a Pakistani immigrant, a Hindu, and a man who started life in care and who was subsequently adopted by Labour-supporting parents. According to Angela Rayner, these men and women are racist, misogynistic scum. Many of the aforementioned Conservative politicians achieve success without any conspicuous social or economic advantage, and some despite its clear absence. Unlike Rayner, all are well educated and highly intelligent. But like Nicola Sturgeon, another populist bigot, Rayner knows her Midwit audience. Similarly, the professional race baiter, arch-Midwit and Labour MP, David Lammy, described members of the European Research Group, a pro-Brexit conservative think tank, as worse than Nazis. Really? Does he know who and what the Nazis were? Or does he consider the loss of EU pet passports to be equivalent to the racist murder of millions of Jews? And all this grotesquely inaccurate, abusive prejudice passed, predictably, without any meaningful censure from the BBC or mainstream press. Yet Boris Johnson's description of Theresa May's hopeless Brexit deal as a surrender document generated hysterical indignation for weeks and was claimed to herald a new low in parliamentary language. This narcissistic subjectivism amounts to a collective inversion of reality, in which the woke midwit is seeing the world as if in a film negative, where dark is light and vice versa. It is Pidcock, Rayner and the Guardian's columnists who are the bigots, not some fictive race of Tories. This kind of hateful, dishonest and divisive abuse should at the very least disqualify the likes of Pidcock, Rayner and Lammy from public office and probably qualify as hate speech. It is indicative of the perversion of the midwit personality, of which Rayner is a good example, that she accuses others of bigotry while confirming her own. Rayner is indeed the most openly bigoted British politician I can remember, and I have had the vote for more than 40 years. The truth is, of course, that Rayner has made a career out of being a potty-mouthed populist yob who is to intelligent political discussion what Bernard Manning was to comedy. This semi-literate, uneducated woman is a deputy leader of a major political party in the foremost democracy on earth and doesn't even have an O-level. The likelihood of such an individual ever gaining access to the levers of political power in France, or for that matter any other major European nation, is zero. It is also worth noting that the Conservative Party, which she describes as bigoted, racist, etc., is far more diverse and inclusive than either the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats, the latter being almost entirely represented by the white middle classes. But as you will find frequently stated in these discussions of the personality deficiencies of the midwit, facts and reason do not feature in their bigoted rantings. The day after Rayner's scum, bigots, racists, homophobes outburst, a Conservative Member of Parliament, David Ames, was stabbed to death during his constituency surgery by a failed asylum seeker and Islamist bigot. Not one single newspaper or BBC commentator made any association between her aggressive abuse of Conservative politicians and the violent act against one it immediately preceded. A couple of weeks later, Boris Johnson made the non-abusive and factually correct observation that the Public Prosecution Service failed to prosecute the serial BBC paedophile Jimmy Savile, while the Labour leader Keir Starmer was at its head. The next day, Keir Starmer was surrounded by a few people and shouted at, prompting the BBC and The Guardian to run front-page headlines for days alleging that Johnson's remarks had been causal in Starmer's subsequent discomfort. This glaring partiality and hypocrisy is meat and drink to the BBC, The Guardian and their ilk, and is systemic to progressive liberal orthodoxy. It's called propaganda. Now, because he is an intellectual fraud, the midwit always wishes to ally himself with what he perceives to be the majority view of educated, enlightened people. Unfortunately for the Midwit, intelligent, well-informed and independent thinkers do not write for either the BBC or The Guardian, and nor do they believe the propaganda and lies in which they trade. They are a small minority of the population who tend to be neither outspoken nor populist, and do not include him. Thus the Midwit is inevitably drawn ever deeper into the spurious certainties and specious arguments of his fellow Midwits. He is deeply resentful of, and very hostile to, well-informed people of genuinely high intelligence who contradict him, especially if they do so with fact-based rational propositions. Try watching the YouTube video of Alistair Campbell debating the urbane, measured and unfailingly polite Douglas Murray, who is Campbell's moral and intellectual superior by a considerable margin, and see how well Campbell copes with contradiction. As Tony Blair's former liar-in-chief, Campbell is a man rightly despised by the British electorate as a lying, bullying thug who helped hoodwink the UK Parliament into entering an illegal war in Iraq on false premises. He is emotionally and intellectually incapable of conducting a civil or rational discussion which allows for the possibility of his having been wrong. He therefore becomes almost psychotically aggressive and abusive within seconds of Murray's contradiction, to the degree that even the experienced moderator Andrew Neil threatens to silence his microphone. Needless to say, Campbell is generous in his description of others as liars and sociopaths, when every sane person in the world can see that he resembles little more than a ranting, unrepentant Rudolf Hess, isolated at Spandau and still loyal to the Nazi cause. The man is demented. He routinely spews out utterly baseless statements about the economic consequences of Brexit, a subject about which he knows nothing, to be feasted upon by his ravenous Midwit audience. Recently on BBC Newsnight, he attacked the presenter, Victoria Derbyshire, and the BBC in general, for allowing people on the show who disagree with him. He interrupts, aggressively talks over and patronises the other guest, the Brexit-supporting Alex Phillips, while jabbing his finger at Derbyshire. When finally silenced by her, he sits back twitching and petulant, his face deformed with rage. This is a man with a pathological need to eviscerate his own self-loathing and to project it onto other people and mythical causes. That he does so through spewing lies and aggressive abuse, while presumably in search of approval, is a measure of his unbridled and utterly repugnant narcissism. Alistair Campbell, in his ignorance, intolerance, intellectual mediocrity, dogmatism, hypocrisy and self-righteousness, is a model Midwit. The thought process of the Midwit, if what takes place between the ears of the Midwit can be aggrandized as thought, is not to be curious about a pertinent question to which he does not know the answer, but merely to identify whether the questioner is in disagreement with him, and therefore to be despised, mistrusted, and above all, silenced. The Midwits of the left uniformly reacted to the elections of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, not by engaging in intelligent analysis of why they were popular and victorious, but by inventing conspiracy theories as to how their victories were in some way not legitimate. They then indulged in an hysterical and unending campaign of character assassination, focused upon alleged historical peccadilloes and scouring their lifetime's written and spoken output for any word or phrase that could be misrepresented to malign them. The woke left do not debate policy. They merely seek to prove that the individual who disagrees with them should not be allowed in the room. The anti-Trump, pro-Democrat media basically spent Trump's entire presidency trying to silence him through impeachment, without ever pausing to consider the reality that he was the elected president of the most powerful democracy on earth, precisely because an electoral majority liked what he had to say. This is typical Midwit narcissism. The Midwit cannot be wrong, and when thwarted, immediately resorts to screeching petulance, self-deluding lies, and abuse. It is because the Midwit cannot directly respond to informed questioning that he constantly refers to invented consensus and imaginary experts, and claims that his orthodoxies are accepted by some fictive intellectual elite. The OECD predicts this, the These scientists said that, and by the way, this famous rapper agrees with them. The Midwit is particularly fond of citing polls and studies, however spurious, which he believes to confirm his certainties. It is, of course, easy to design such polls and studies and frame their questions so as to prejudice, if not indeed dictate, their outcome. If the Midwit fears a wrong answer, he simply won't ask the question. If the poll or study produces the wrong answer, he will either suppress it or obfuscate the outcome through disingenuous presentation of its results. The irony being that while these activities are really just lies and base propaganda, the Midwit falls into the trap of believing his own bullshit. Many of the so-called national polls and studies they cite involve samples of fewer than 2,000 people, and God only knows what the questions were. The typical study trumpeted by The Guardian will turn out to be the opinions of 3 Labour activists. Quite how you pretend to gauge the electoral intentions of a diverse nation of over 65 million people on the basis of asking a few bored people who happen to answer the phone defies any statistical understanding I have, and indeed they are always wrong about issues in which the Midwits are invested. The truth is, they make them up. The BBC and The Guardian specialise in this type of misinformation, and only ever publish or cite polls and studies which agree with their Midwit agendas. Every poll they published before and after the Brexit referendum indicated, remarkably, a clear margin in favour of Remain. After 3 years of claiming that the Brexit referendum was rigged, based on lies and democratically invalid, the Midwits finally got their second referendum in the form of a general election. Inexplicably, and contrary to all their studies, polls and experts, the British electorate once again voted in favour of leave, and by a massive margin. This disjunct arises because the narcissism and feeble-mindedness of the Midwit causes him to subordinate reality to his idealised version of it, in which he is all-knowing, always right, and always gets his own way. He thus spends his time in futile wish-fulfillment, denying outcomes he does not like, ignoring people, facts and arguments that contradict him, and attempting to reverse engineer causality to conform to his prejudice. This is what I want, I must have it, and therefore the world will give it to me, even if the false evidence supporting that likelihood are lies of my own manufacture. The irony of the Remain refrain that Brexiters were lied to and misled is that it was the Remainers who were lied to and misled, and they were lied to by each other. Midwits all have the same simplistic opinions on highly complex issues, which they cretinise into binary moral choices. In the world of the Midwit, you are either right or you are wrong, with wrong being defined as disagreeing with him. His stupid opinions are thus extolled as pieties. The Midwit loves to virtue signal. He likes to wear a Ukrainian flag on his lapel. He likes to be seen clapping the NHS. He wears his COVID mask with pride. If you challenge the Midwit, you are not only ignorant and wrong, but actually evil. In order to further demonise the sins of those who disagree with him, the Midwit likes to catastrophise its consequences. A failure to agree with him will lead to apocalyptic disaster, and a desire to have an informed debate about his assumptions is clear evidence of being an agent of that disaster. If you want to discuss immigration, you must be a racist. Brexit can't be difficult, with both positives and negatives. It must be a car crash, a cliff edge, and a shit show. The lights will go out, there will be no food on the shelves, and within weeks we will have all returned to the Dark Ages. This hypothetical disaster then becomes, in the cramped mind of the Midwit, a universal certainty. A questioner who seeks an intelligent discussion on the actual premise for this catastrophe narrative then becomes a denier of the Midwit's invented certainty, and thus a heretic eligible for cancellation and abuse. This vicious bigotry arises because of the Midwit's neurotic fear of his own ordinariness. He hates himself and so must project that self-loathing onto those who represent what he would like to be, i.e. intelligent, well-informed and capable of critical thinking. A pernicious consequence of this is that the Midwit constantly seeks to other those who disagree with him. This process operates, psychologically, much like racism, inasmuch as it seeks to generalise about a group of people, to denigrate them, characterise them as stupid, bigoted, or even evil, and make them the enemy. Brexit voters are gammons. They are thick, contemptible, and racist. Trump supporters are rotten-toothed rednecks. Tories are scum. Thus the Midwit, who postures from his imagined moral high ground, is in fact nothing more than a self-righteous bigot, and far more unpleasant than the people he insults. Obviously, not all Midwits are equal, either in stupidity, ignorance, or character deformity. The less intelligent, and probably largely benign majority, are those who dislike confrontation and are browbeaten into acquiescence by woke propaganda and bullying. The average Guardian reader or Radio 4 listener probably just lacks the intellectual wherewithal to realise he is being lied to, rather than being a fully blown narcissist or sociopath. The more intelligent and influential Midwits, conversely, require severely deformed personality traits to enable them to prosecute their ideologically driven lies. In short, they should know better. Emily Maitlis, the Romaniac pushed out of the BBC as a result of public outrage at her bigoted anti-Brexit rantings, and it takes some doing to be pushed out of the anti-Brexit BBC for being anti-Brexit, actually claims that BBC impartiality guidelines prevented her from doing her job, and can say that with a straight face. What she is saying is that if she comes into conflict with impartiality guidelines, they must be biased. This should be a parody of the entitled self-righteous narcissist. She is incapable of considering that her opinions or conduct may be flawed. The only explanation available to her warped mind is that the BBC is wrong, the public are wrong, and that there is some nefarious conspiracy at work to deprive us of her inviolable personal truth. Fertile grounds for such sociopathic certainties and the mindless binary judgments upon which Midwits feed include Brexit, the NHS, Obama, Trump, Israel, Boris Johnson, climate change, immigration, COVID, especially lockdowns, and so on. Indeed, Midwits tend to share the same opinions and ignorance of the subjects upon which they express them, to the degree that once one has identified the characteristic intellectual limitations and personality deformities I have described, those opinions can be accurately predicted without specific inquiry. Unsurprisingly, Midwits cluster around the ideological shibboleths of the so-called progressive liberal left, because ideological certainties appeal to the emotionally twisted and the intellectually limited. The politics of the left is essentially the politics of resentment, and as Midwits are always angry about something, this, along with catastrophic narratives and the confected loathing of evil enemies, holds an irresistible appeal for them. Egregious examples of the Midwit, in addition to those already mentioned, include Lord Adonis, the imbecile New Labour Romaniac, Naga Munchetti, formerly of the BBC, now nobody, Ian Hislop, the embittered little genetic off-cut and alleged BBC comedian, John Bercow, that poisoned dwarf who thought he could pervert the course of democracy, Nick Cohen, the whining Guardian journalist and mentally ill Romaniac, Sonita Allain, the Midwit master of Jesus College, Cambridge and diversity hire extraordinaire, who has set about vandalising the college's history and finances in the name of critical race theory, Gareth Southgate, the unlettered Oik England football coach, whose team took the Black Lives Matter knee and then took the racist, sexist Arab dollar at the World Cup, Justin Welby, the anti-Brexit woke idiot Archbishop in the Church of England, Gary Lineker, another illiterate footballer who spews his moronic opinions from the BBC pulpit, anyone else who writes for The Guardian or New York Times and most of their readers, all Liberal Democrats and supporters of the Green Party, all BBC comedians, anyone sympathetic to Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, Alcoholics Anonymous, Just Stop Oil, Greta Thunberg, and anyone who ever went on a People's Vote march, not to mention vegans in general, or Sir Keir Starmer specifically. You have been warned. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you have heard, please like, subscribe and share. We do need to push back. I'm Regular Chap, and this is what's wrong.